The time we live in is often referred to as the information age. Thanks to advances in computers, miniaturization, computer networking, the internet, we're connected to the world around us in ways that we didn't even think were possible just a couple of decades ago. So many of us carry around a device in our pockets. This allows us to contact people across the globe from wherever we want to be. And thanks to the internet, with the touch of a screen, we have access to almost the entirety of human knowledge. But imagine for a second if this were taken away. Imagine what it would be like if you were isolated from the rest of humanity. Or to put it another way, imagine what it would be like to truly live on another world. My name is Andrzej Stewart, and I was the Chief Engineering Officer of High Seas Mission 4. What is High Seas, you might ask? High Seas is short for the Hawaii Space Exploration Analog and Simulation. It's a facility on the northern face of the Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii. There, NASA uses this to study the psychological effects of deep space missions on astronauts. They simulate Mars missions. People are isolated from 4 months up to a year at a time. NASA wants to understand the stresses, the things that challenge astronauts that go to Mars, things like being disconnected from home, being on their own with just a few other crew members, being isolated to a small space. As you can see, High Seas is very isolated, and it's indeed something called an isolated and confined environment. It's of course not the only one on Earth. The International Space Station, submarines at sea, Antarctic research stations are all isolated and confined environments, and these all share some characteristics. They're all remote, far from the rest of humanity. They're very unwelcoming environments. They're not very safe environments sometimes. They're usually difficult to access, and once you're there, they're difficult to leave. The people inside can't leave to go outside very often, if at all, and whenever they do, they usually have to wear protective gear to keep them safe from the environment. And finally, and most importantly probably for NASA's purposes, these are usually manned by crews that are selected for their skills to fulfill certain roles, rather than because they knew each other before the mission. Whenever astronauts go to Mars, they're going to be in a variety of isolated, confined environments as well. They're going to be inside spaceships to get them to and from Mars, and inside of habitats on the Martian surface. Those Martian astronauts will face those same challenges, but they'll face one additional challenge as well: the challenge of communication and the speed of light. You see, whenever Martian astronauts go to Mars, the only way they're going to be able to talk with the people back on Earth is through radio signals, or perhaps some of the laser communications that NASA is currently studying. These communications move through space at the speed of light. Now, we think of the speed of light as being very fast, 300,000 kilometers per second. If light were to travel around the circumference of Earth, it would be able to do so in just over 1/10 of a second. For our purposes, light is almost instantaneous. But whenever you're talking about space, perhaps the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy put it the best. Space is big. Really big. You just won't believe how vastly, hugely, mind-bogglingly big it is. So let me help you try and grasp just how big space is. Obviously, we're talking about Earth and Mars here. So let's talk about the distance between Earth and Mars. As it flashed up there, the distance between Earth and Mars can vary depending on where they are between their orbits. Anywhere from 55 million kilometers to 401 million kilometers. At the speed of light, signals travel that distance anywhere from 3 minutes to over 22 minutes. Imagine what a phone call would be like. You pick up your phone from Mars and you talk to your buddy back on Earth. How you doing, man? How's it going? You wait 22 minutes and your friend gets the call. Oh, I'm doing great. How are you? And then you wait 22 minutes again. That doesn't sound very convenient. That's definitely not the kind of phone call I'd want to have. So it turns out whenever astronauts go to Mars, they're not going to be able to use telephones. They're going to be limited to things like emails or recorded messages sent over that 22-minute time delay. There's another problem as well. I showed you that big dish before, and that's a huge piece of equipment. It takes a lot of power to get a signal from Earth to Mars and back. We've been able to sort of get broadband data rates from the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, but whenever we send signals to Mars, the best we do right now is about 2,000 bits per second. Now, for the people who don't speak in bits and bytes, that's not a lot of information. You definitely won't be streaming YouTube to Mars at those sort of speeds. So astronauts may have some sites that are sent to them occasionally, things like Wikipedia, things they can use for reference. But there's going to be no social media on Mars and definitely no YouTube. The high seas habitat is designed to model these effects. NASA, of course, again, wants to study psychological effects. What is it like for the astronauts to be there? Communication is a big deal there. So NASA imposes certain constraints on us crew members. For example, we were only allowed to use email or recorded video or audio messages to communicate with the outside world, to mission controllers and to our friends and family back on Earth. We had limited internet, so we were allowed to access things like Wikipedia, things that, again, would be beamed in sort of a static sense to the astronauts on the surface, but we didn't have access to any sort of website that would allow us to communicate with humanity in the real world. So again, no social media and no YouTube either. So this sounds very difficult, sounds very challenging. And we understand now, and I hope all you too understand the physical reasons why these constraints are in place. But what is it like to actually experience that? I had a chance to live at this habitat for 12 months, an entire year, to help NASA study this and to experience it myself. So perhaps I can give a little bit of insight. There are many challenges again, but it turns out there are some benefits to being in this sort of environment as well. Let's start with those challenges first. There are lots of challenges. To start, conversations are slow. You may have already gotten that sense whenever I gave you that example of a phone call. Whenever we talk to people in real life, whenever we have a conversation, you stand in front of someone and you speak, and those people hear what you're saying, they react, they respond back, and back and forth. As you have a conversation, the ideas evolve. Once you put a delay in there, that makes that evolution very difficult. If you have to wait 20 minutes between each reply. It makes it so that conversations that would take just a few minutes here on Earth take hours, days, or sometimes even weeks to complete. Something that makes it even slower is typing emails. It's very easy to stand in front of people and talk. It's just very natural. But whenever you're typing an email, that takes time. It takes more time to proofread. So it's very slow and very difficult. There's a loss of information involved as well. Now, I'm not talking about the sort of loss of information that happens when stuff breaks. Although for what it's worth, the astronauts will have to face those problems as well whenever, say, a satellite dish breaks down. But what I'm talking about is a loss of meaning. You see, whenever we talk to each other, we don't just use words. The way we enunciate our words, our body language, our facial expressions, all of those convey meaning. And that's meaning that's lost whenever you're limited to just emails. Even whenever we have the ability to record audio or video messages, there's still a little bit of meaning lost because there's a big difference in just talking to a very cold, unfeeling camera and talking to the person who's really behind that camera, separated in time and space. Often there's a feeling of frustration or helplessness. Again, whenever you're in that environment where you're separated in time and space, you type your emails, you send them, and then you hope there's somebody on the other end listening. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. Back on Earth, whenever you have a real conversation, there's an immediate feedback. You see the person, you get the sense that they understand you. And whenever they don't, you can work right there to help correct and help with meaning and understanding. That's taken away whenever you're separated. Often I would wonder, what's happening back on Earth? Is anybody out there? Is anybody back home listening? Sometimes it was unintentional. Sometimes it was just that the people we were talking with didn't understand the situation we were in. For an example of this, one of our crew members had a problem with their cell phone. Now, wait a second, Andrzej just said there were no phones on Mars. That's true, we'd all canceled our cell phone service. The problem is, one of our crew members was being charged for their cell phone service again. This company, of course, thought that our crew member had a cell phone and could just solve the problem using their phone and had no way to solve this over email. Now, eventually the problem was solved, but it required that crew member talking with the mission control team over email, the mission control team contacting the company and letting them know, hey, this person's on Mars. They really can't use their phone right now. The problem was solved, but it would have been much easier if that person could have just picked up the phone and solved it themselves. There's also sort of a restriction on the information that you get while you're on Mars. You hear about the big things that happen on planet Earth. For example, the Paris attacks were a major impact on our crew, especially our French crew member Cyprien, who has friends and family in Paris. So these big things are things that are felt literally a world away. But sort of the small everyday things, sort of what your friends are doing at the weekend, or what's happening at your local theater, what's showing there this weekend, those aren't things you get to hear about. It really doesn't have space in the communications. So you lose a lot of these things. It's something I thought of a lot was, I wonder what's going on back on Earth right now. What's popular? What sort of music are people listening to? What's on TV? Turns out it was Harambe and Pen Pineapple Apple Pen. And for all of you laughing right now, though, imagine if you didn't know what those were, that you were the only person on the planet who hadn't heard of those things. You might have experienced this before. If you've ever been on a vacation, say to like Disneyland, and you've been gone for a couple of weeks, and you've been focusing on all the fun you're having, you've kind of lost track of what's going on back home. Then you go back and all this stuff has happened and you have to catch up. Now multiply that by a year, and that's what it felt like for us. It's almost like stepping into a time machine. Whenever astronauts go to Mars, it won't just be a journey through space, it'll also be a journey through time. And whenever those astronauts come back, the world they return to will be a very different place from the world they left. So this doesn't sound like a lot of fun, really. It sounds like there's all these challenges. It's a very difficult thing, and certainly it is, but it turns out there are some benefits to this as well. For instance, not having the internet. I'm sure everyone's had that moment where they've been doing their work and they don't want to do work anymore. So Facebook calls, or there's just a couple of videos of cute cats you want to watch. Often we find ourselves there as well. We're people like the rest of y'all. But we would stop our work, we would go to the internet and realize we didn't have it. We didn't have those Facebook feeds to take our time. We couldn't watch those pictures of the cute cats, and well, if that's all you've got, well, I guess it's time to get to work then. We were more productive there than we have ever been in our entire lives. We were able to get so much done, just because the distraction had been taken away. Another benefit is the ability to control the information that you're taking in. So, as I'd said before, a lot of the restriction of information is unintentional. But you sort of get a chance to choose what you want to listen to as well. And for an example of this, I'm actually going to talk about a different mission I did. This was the Human Exploration Research Analog at Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. This was a 2-week mission I did a few months before I went to high seas. Now, just like the real astronauts on the International Space Station, the Hera crew members receive newspapers electronically every day. They do this so the crew members of both Hera and the ISS can feel connected to the real world. And I read the newspaper on mission day 1. On mission day 2, I opened that newspaper, turned to the front page, and I saw depressing things. I saw war. I saw crime. I saw murder. I saw conflicts around the world. I closed the newspaper and didn't read another one for the rest of the mission. Turns out that I found out during our debriefings, the rest of my crew members had done the same thing on the same day and for the same reasons. Being in an environment like that, where you're focused on science, where your whole environment is about pushing humanity forwards, things like war, things like crime just don't exist anymore. None of us were preparing to wage armed conflict against our fellow crew members. None of us were going to rob or steal from our fellow crew members. We were focused on science. On high seas, we actually had a standing order with our mission support team to send us daily science news, because that's what drove us. That's what inspired us, and that's what we were there to do. It's almost like a monk going to a monastery. It gives those people a chance to focus on what's important to them. So I've talked about all this. What's it like to be separated from the rest of humanity? And sure, this sounds great for people going to Mars or people at least simulating it, but is there something here for the folks on Earth that we can learn as well? I think so. To start, as I've tried to emphasize, there's power in face-to-face communication. Being able to stand with somebody, to look at them in the eye and speak with them. There's power in that. Our devices sort of repeatedly pull us away from that world. We have jobs nowadays where people are required to be on email 24/7. We have Facebook and Twitter feeds that demand our attention at all times of day. And there's a benefit to unplugging, to putting those devices away and interacting with the people around us. Being present in our interactions with other people and with the world. There's another benefit from unplugging as well, and that's the ability to focus. Because of all the technology, it's almost as if we have a constant stream of information coming towards us. And a lot of that information is bad news. Again, the war, the politics, the crime. It makes the world seem like a very scary place, honestly. But by unplugging, it gives us the ability to choose what it is we want to focus on. We get to choose rather than letting that information stream decide for us. If you guys do unplug, I hope you come to the same conclusions that I have from my mission. That even though the world is scary, there's lots of scary things going on, there's a lot of confusion out there. But there's also great things going on as well. I really appreciated the chance to go to high seas and for a year focus on science. And there are people throughout the world doing the same thing every day. There are things we know today that we didn't know yesterday. And I can tell you that there are people working right now so that there will be more for all of you to discover tomorrow. In addition to that, I hope you'll find that the world is an amazing place. It's lush, it's vibrant, it's full of life. It's like no other world we've ever found out in the universe. And believe me, we've got a lot of smart people looking for them. I hope ultimately what you'll find is that our world is full of hope and inspiration for those willing to look for it. Thank you very much.